Hey guys, tonight we time travel with our forks not to a wild medieval battlefield or a Roman bathhouse, but to a dinner table. A long, candlelit one, with velvet drapes fluttering in the breeze and a roast peacock on the platter, dyed bright blue for reasons no one can fully explain. You're not fighting for glory. You're navigating a 5-course feast with mysterious sauce blobs, strange spices, and zero idea what half of this is made from. This is the world of Renaissance food, and honestly, you probably won't survive this without a nap halfway through the appetizer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start in a medieval kitchen. Not the romantic kind with pies cooling on windowsills, but the real deal, smoky, cramped, and vaguely terrifying. The food mostly bread, broth, and hope. A lot of porridges, some salted meats, vegetables boiled until they gave up. And if you were lucky, a piece of fish that didn't smell too fishy. Meals back then weren't about taste. They were about survival. Food was dictated by class, religion, and what was growing outside. The wealthy might enjoy more variety, but even then, their food wasn't necessarily better, just more plentiful, and occasionally served on a plate made of lead, which, let's not even get into. But then comes the Renaissance. Somewhere around the 14th century, whispers of change start floating on the wind, along with the scent of imported spices and meat that's actually been roasted instead of stewed to oblivion. Something shifts. A hunger appears not just for food, but for art, beauty, identity, and presentation. Food begins to transform from sustenance to statement. You step into an upper-class Italian home, and the difference is immediate. There's color, scent, texture, roasted meats, tarts, fresh herbs. You see people sitting down to eat, not just because they're hungry, but because eating is becoming an event. Meals stretch into hours. Courses are invented. Table manners are slowly, very slowly becoming a thing. And no, it's not just Florence. The whole continent begins to buzz. In France, nobility begin borrowing Italian cooks. In Spain, new fruits and ingredients arrive from across the sea. In Germany, meat-heavy feasts begin to feel slightly more refined, with the occasional exotic ingredient tossed in for flair. Even England starts catching on, though they still have a deep-rooted affection for mutton that borders on the emotional. You hear a joke in the streets of Venice, you are what you eat, and I am now 30% cinnamon, which is only funny because it's true. Spices become the currency of the kitchen. Sugar, pepper, cloves, they're expensive, exotic, and everywhere. The old, bland medieval fare is quietly phased out by those who can afford the change. And those who can't, well, they get creative with what's left. One quirky trend that emerges: illusion foods dishes made to look like other things. A pie that bleeds red wine? A roast made to resemble a swan but filled with pigeon. Historians still argue whether these were genuinely appreciated or simply endured in silence by guests too polite to question the chef's mental state. Meanwhile, the notion of the individual palate begins to matter. What do you like to eat becomes a meaningful question. Preferences emerge, recipes are recorded, kitchens evolve, utensils appear, and slowly, food stops being a necessity and starts becoming a reflection of self. By the end of the 15th century, the transformation is undeniable. The Renaissance hasn't just changed art and science, it's rewired your taste buds. And as you lean back in your carved wooden chair, crumbs on your lap, goblet in hand, you realize something astonishing. Food has become culture, and dinner is only just getting started. The kitchen is hotter than Hades on laundry day. You step through a stone archway into a world that hisses, clangs, bubbles, and belches smoke like a moody volcano. The heat slaps your face first, followed by the scent something between roasted meat and slightly scorched ambition. This is not a medieval hearth where food is boiled in a single pot hung over a fire. No, this is a Renaissance kitchen, and it's on the edge of becoming a laboratory. And you're the wide-eyed assistant with soot on your tunic and no clue where to set down the basket of leeks. You'd be forgiven for thinking kitchens before this era were crude. Because, well, they kind of were. In the medieval world, food was often prepared over a central fire, using tools that looked more like blacksmith gear than anything culinary. Soot covered the walls. Spits rotated on creaky iron hooks. Recipes weren't written down, they were inherited by mouth, and not always with enthusiasm. But by the late 1400s, everything is shifting. Innovation isn't just for astronomers and artists anymore. The kitchen becomes a new canvas for experimentation, and cooks begin demanding better tools. Instead of one pot for all, you now have multiple vessels, copper saucepans, glazed clay baking dishes, long-handled pans for frying, and even brace-yourself ovens built into the wall. Yes, actual ovens. No longer just the domain of bakers or dragons. The result: you can now bake pies without turning the entire house into a bonfire. You can simmer sauces instead of boiling them into unrecognizable glob. And you can roast meat with more than just a stick and hope. Another breakthrough: chimneys. Oh yes, glorious, glorious chimneys. Suddenly kitchens don't fill with enough smoke to summon a priest. With proper ventilation, cooks can actually breathe while they work. Radical, really. The layout changes too. No longer just a fire in a corner. Renaissance kitchens are designed. Work tables are elevated your back, thanks you. Spice racks are organized, kind of. And food preparation is now divided into zones. Meat here, bread there, sauces in the back, chaos in the middle. You glance to your left and spot a spit boy, a young kitchen helper, whose entire job is to rotate the spit by hand. All day. Every day. He's already glazed in sweat and mumbling a song about chickens. You wave. He doesn't wave back. There's also a hierarchy forming. This kitchen doesn't just have a cook. It has a head chef, assistants, spit turners, larders, and scullery workers. It's a full production team. In noble houses and courts, these teams operate with military precision. Ingredients are counted. Mistakes are tallied. Salt is monitored like gold. And here comes a curious detail: kitchen uniforms. Yes, people start wearing designated clothing to work in the kitchen. Not to be fashionable, just to avoid looking like they rolled through a grease fire. Aprons, caps, even some form of shoes that survive the inevitable wine spill. One quirky practice you see firsthand. The chef tastes everything with a long-handled spoon. Not for hygiene, but because the sauces might still be boiling. Burnt tongues were the price of impatience. Historians still argue whether the emergence of organized kitchens began with the Italian courts or the French, but wherever it started, it spread fast. By the mid-1500s, even mid-tier households began mimicking the structure, if not the grandeur, of noble kitchens. You watch a cook carefully slice a pear, layer it over flaky pastry, and glaze it with something sweet and shiny. A dish that once would have been thrown together in a single pot is now composed. It has layers, intention, and yes, flavor. You step closer to the hearth, where a large copper pot bubbles gently. A young assistant is stirring it like it's a potion. Saffron, he says, without looking up. Imported from Valencia. Costs more than my shoes. You ask if it's worth it. He shrugs. If it makes the Lord smile and not throw his cup, definitely. And here's a little twist while these fancy kitchens flourish in wealthy households. Peasants and townsfolk are also adapting. The technology trickles down. Smaller stoves, clay ovens in communal spaces, shared recipes. Suddenly, even common folk can bake bread with some dignity. It's a quiet revolution. Not painted in gold leaf or sung in ballads, but tasted daily. Tonight, as the kitchen winds down, you help clean the knives, wipe the counters, and stow the herbs. You rub oil into the wooden spoons to keep them from splitting. And you realize in this moment that this is where the real magic happens. Not in the banquet hall, not on the silver platters, but here, where water hisses on hot pans and rosemary crackles on fire. You wipe your hands, take one last deep breath of sage and smoke, and step out into the dark corridor. Your belly rumbles. It's a good sign. The spoon lands on your plate with a quiet clink, and suddenly, you're very aware that everyone's watching you. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you just committed a faux pas. You picked up your meat with your fingers. Again, someone clears their throat gently. Someone else raises an eyebrow. You glance down at your plate, then at the little pointed instrument beside it 2 times. Polished, delicate. A fork. A Renaissance fork, which in this era is both a utensil and a statement. See, tonight you're not just eating, you're witnessing the dawn of table manners, a slow, awkward revolution where etiquette, posture, and cutlery are about to make you question everything you thought you knew about putting food in your face. Let's back up. For centuries, people ate with their fingers, knives, and the occasional spoon. That was normal, acceptable, even expected. Napkins optional, plates often shared. And if you dropped something, you picked it up and kept chewing. Waste not, want not. But now, something's changing. The Renaissance doesn't just transform what people eat, it reshapes how they eat. Because with more refined food comes the expectation of more refined behavior. And so enters the fork, stage left. Originally used in Byzantium, the fork was viewed with suspicion in Western Europe. In fact, one Venetian princess who used one in the 11th century was called decadent. Some even whispered that it was effeminate or sinful to stab your food instead of handling it like a good Christian. Yes, apparently the devil works in stainless steel. But by the 16th century, thanks to Italy's influence, especially from the court of Catherine de' Medici, forks begin sneaking onto tables in France and beyond. Still rare, still controversial, but undeniably elegant. You watch a courtier gracefully spear a poached pear cube, dab it in spiced wine sauce, and raise it to her lips without smearing anything. Magic. You glance at your own fingers. Sticky. Historians still argue whether forks were adopted for hygiene, fashion, or pure snobbery. The answer is likely all three. And while nobles debate the angle of the wrist and the appropriateness of licking tines, you begin to notice something else. Table manners have become a form of theater. There's the way you sit upright, attentive, elbows off the table. There's the way you chew quietly, discreetly. No lip smacking unless you want exile. There's even a correct way to wipe your mouth dab gently with a napkin. Which, by the way, you're supposed to place on your lap. not tuck into your shirt like a bib-wearing gladiator. These details may seem small, but they're loaded with meaning. Manners become social currency. They signal class, upbringing, refinement. A person who eats without dropping sauce on their doublet is obviously civilized and therefore more trustworthy, more desirable, more Renaissance. And guess what? You're judged before you even swallow. The number of people who panic over where to sit, which knife to use, like when to speak, it's almost funny. Almost? Until you're the one holding the wrong goblet and sipping from the finger bowl. You learn to wait for the host before eating. To avoid cutting bread with a knife unless it's crusty. To never reach across the table. One poor soul does just that. And someone hisses. Are you a peasant or just raised by wolves? You pretend not to hear. Interestingly, not all rules make sense. Some are regional. Some are invented on the spot. One noble insists you must chew each bite 13 times. Another declares that picking your teeth with a knife is uncouth unless you cover your mouth with your left hand while doing it, in which case it's quite charming. The same goes for serving order. Food is brought out in courses, yes. Actual courses now, and knowing when to start eating is a delicate art. Jump in too soon. Rude, wait too long, you'll miss the best part. You overhear a guest ask, "Do you eat the parsley garnish or is it decorative?" The answer, it depends on who's watching. And there's another layer to all this gendered behavior. Men are expected to carve meat with flair, slice bread in even pieces, and assist women by offering dishes politely. Women, in turn, are expected to eat delicately, avoid anything messy, and never suck marrow from a bone, no matter how good it tastes. One woman does it anyway. You secretly admire her. So does half the room. They just won't say it aloud. Beyond the aristocracy, manners begin to trickle down. Townsfolk pick up certain habits. Guilds start setting standards for communal meals. You hear whispers of books being written, manuals on proper conduct at the table. Soon, these will be published guides, passed down like holy texts for future generations who will someday invent salad forks and panic over soup etiquette. Tonight, as you set your own plate aside and lean back, you notice how still the room is. Every motion is careful. Every bite measured. There's a rhythm to it. A choreography. You close your eyes and imagine a time when none of this existed. When people ate with their hands and didn't worry about who wiped their fingers first. But now you know the truth. Dinner isn't just a meal anymore. It's a performance. And you're learning the steps, one fork at a time. The air smells faintly of cinnamon and clove, and behind that, a darker, earthier note nutmeg. A spice so small and wrinkled, yet so outrageously expensive that entire wars will someday be fought over it. And you're watching it being shaved delicately into a simmering pot of wine, like gold dust into molten alchemy. You're standing in the middle of a Renaissance kitchen again, but this time your eyes aren't on the bread or the meat. They're on the spice rack. Because in this era, spice is power. You reach toward a jar of ginger, maybe, and the cook slaps your hand away. "That's worth more than you are," she says. Not cruelly, but factually. And she's not wrong. In some cities, a small pouch of pepper could pay your rent. A few strands of saffron. A week's wages? These aren't seasoning. They're status symbols. And where are they coming from? Farther than you can imagine? From Indian ports? From Indonesian islands? From North African caravans? The spice trade weaves a dizzying thread across oceans and deserts, connecting people who will never meet but will absolutely argue about how much cinnamon goes in a pie. You hear a merchant boasting that he traveled to Alexandria and back just to fetch a chest of cloves. Another claims his pepper came straight from Calicut, blessed by the gods of fire themselves. You suspect at least half of these stories are lies, but that doesn't make them less powerful. In the Renaissance, spice sells stories, and stories sell respect. Historians still argue whether the spice craze was about flavor or preservation. One camp says the spices mask the taste of bad meat. Others scoff, saying if you could afford spices, you could afford fresh meat. Either way, the obsession is real. One thing's for certain, spices become culinary gold. They start appearing in dishes both sweet and savory. Chicken with cinnamon, fish with cloves, beef cooked in sugar and pepper. Dishes that baffle your modern brain but delight the Renaissance palate. And it gets weirder. Some nobles take to coloring their food with spices and herbs just for visual flair. A sauce made yellow with saffron. A tart dyed purple with beetroot and honey. One cook even crafts a green chicken dish using parsley and mint. You ask what it tastes like. She shrugs. Mostly green. But beyond taste and presentation, spices also carry cultural weight. To serve a heavily spiced dish at your table says, I am worldly. I am wealthy. I have access to lands you only dream about. And let's not forget the subtle implication I can afford to waste these. There's also a medical layer. Remember, this is a time when food and health are deeply intertwined. People still believe in the theory of humors, the four bodily fluids that must be balanced: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And spices are seen as a way to correct imbalance. Feeling sluggish? Add pepper to warm the body. Too much cold in your system. Nutmeg will fix it. You hear a physician say ginger is good for the stomach and clove calms melancholy. You nod. Chewing a honeyed biscuit that's probably doing nothing for your bile but is absolutely making you feel better. One eccentric noble you encounter insists on perfuming his rooms with cinnamon smoke before every meal. It opens the appetite, he explains, while his guests cough discreetly behind their fans. And then there are the spice cabinets locked. In many households, literally locked. Only the head cook or mistress of the house has the key. Spices are rationed, guarded, and sometimes even inventoried like precious metals. You once saw a cook write down, in shaky script, 1 pinch of mace, 1 scratch of nutmeg, 3 grains of pepper. It read like poetry, or paranoia. This obsession also fuels exploration. Across Europe, explorers are setting out on dangerous voyages in the name of spices. You overhear someone muttering that Columbus set sail not to find a new world, but a shortcut to India's spice-rich shores? Oops. You taste a dish later that night, venison roasted with juniper and dusted with cinnamon sugar. It's strange, rich, a little confusing, but it lingers on your tongue, like memory, like ambition. And that's the thing about spices. They don't just change how food tastes, they change how people see the world. They inspire travel, trade, theft, diplomacy, war. They're tiny, but they move empires. People kill for them, marry for them, write songs about them. One cook claims his grandfather met his wife over a spilled jar of cumin. You believe him, and later, when you're back in the quiet of your room, curled up by the hearth with the faint scent of cardamom still clinging to your sleeves, you realize something. The Renaissance didn't just revolutionize cooking. It perfumed it, transformed it from local and limited to vast and visionary. You drift off wondering how much saffron it would take to buy a better mattress. Probably more than you'll ever see. You're crouched in the corner of a dim library, eyes skimming across worn pages the color of steeped tea, and your fingers smell faintly of ink, dust, and time. You're not here to borrow books you can't. You're not even supposed to be reading them. But you've found something that's not a prayer, or a poem, or a letter. It's a cookbook. And no, not the leather-bound, full-color, recipe and grocery list combo you're used to. This one is written in tight, spidery script, barely legible, and it doesn't even bother with measurements. It just says things like, boil until done, or add herbs as fits your mood. There's a wine stain across the corner of one page. It smells like roasted almonds. And it's beautiful. Because you're witnessing the moment when people began to write down how they cook, not for memory, not for magic, but for sharing, preserving, and showing off. In the Middle Ages, recipes were largely oral. They passed from cook to cook like kitchen whispers. A pinch of this, a splash of that. But the Renaissance changes things. The printing press arrives, and suddenly, words can multiply. Thoughts, ideas, instructions they can travel. And food, being everyone's favorite hobby besides not dying, gets caught in the crossfire. The earliest Renaissance cookbooks aren't really about home cooking. They're manuals for elite chefs. Take Bartolomeo Scappi, personal cook to a pope, who publishes Opera dell'arte del cucinare in 1570, a 6-volume masterpiece that details not just recipes, but kitchen design, carving technique, and how to host a banquet for 1,000 people without losing your mind. Okay, that last part might be implied. Historians still debate whether these books were used in actual kitchens or were more symbolic a flex. A show of culinary literacy. Either way, they're everywhere now. In France, in Spain, in England, each with their own flavor, literally and figuratively. One curious detail: recipes often don't list timing or temperatures. Cook until it smells right is an actual instruction. So is beat well with a stick. You make a mental note not to confuse that one with medical advice. These books also reveal social dynamics. Rich dishes are emphasized. Exotic ingredients are highlighted. There's a heavy lean toward performance feasts where dishes resemble animals or include live birds inside pies. Yes, that actually happened. One Italian recipe begins with first, secure your peacock, and ends with redress the bird in its feathers before serving. You blink, then reread it. Nope. Still weird. And yet, amid the extravagance, something deeper is happening. These books become a way to preserve knowledge, culinary lineage. They document what people ate, how they thought about food, and what values they stirred into their stew pots. Some recipes are practical, others are aspirational, some are, frankly, suspicious, but all of them speak to a new idea that cooking isn't just survival. It's art, it's identity, it's worth writing down. And not just for the elite. Soon, simplified cookbooks emerge for the growing middle-class merchants. Artisans, folks with enough money to care how their dinner turns out. These books offer recipes with cheaper ingredients, more relatable tips, and fewer birds that need to be redressed in feathers. Progress. One woman you meet, Marion, keeps her own handwritten recipe book tucked beneath a jar of beans in her pantry. It's filled with annotations. Too salty, try less cheese. Don't trust the butcher on Wednesdays. Add more sage if serving to in-laws. Her children will inherit it. Her granddaughter will write in the margins. And hundreds of years later, someone will find it and wonder who she was. Cookbooks are also a snapshot of regional identity. Italian books lean into pasta, herbs, and seasonal vegetables. French ones begin romanticizing sauces. English ones are obsessed with meat pies and stewed fruits. There's pride in these pages, mixed with a healthy dose of competition. You read one preface that basically says, "This book corrects the many errors of the previous one." Burn. Another interesting thread. Recipes become more scientific over time. Early Renaissance cooks rely on taste and instinct. But as the century advances, you begin to see the seeds of precision, weighing ingredients, timing steps. Some even flirt with early food chemistry, like how acids affect texture or which woods burn hotter for roasting. You get the sense that cooking is becoming a discipline, not just a domestic task. And then there's the poetry. Yes, some recipes are written like poems. Rhyming instructions, lyrical phrasing, food as language. You read one about pickled pears that ends with "serve in silver," but eat with joy. You write it down just because. Tonight, you sit with a stolen scrap of parchment and try to write your own recipe. Something simple. Bread. Maybe. You scribble flour like dust. Water, but not too much. Knead with kindness. You smile. You've written your first cookbook line. It will never be published, but it's real. Because in this moment, you realize the Renaissance didn't just revolutionize what people ate. It taught them to remember it, to pass it down, to say, "This is who I was. This is what fed me. And maybe this is how I loved." You stand at the edge of a banquet hall that glows like an oil painting brought to life, candelabras dripping wax, chandeliers swaying slightly in the breeze from an open balcony, the scent of roasted pheasant wafting over polished silver platters. But you're not here for the food. You're here for the chef. He stands near the kitchen doors, arms folded, wearing a tall white cap that's somewhere between majestic and absurd. His name is Maestro Giovanni, and tonight he's the closest thing this Renaissance court has to a rock star. Yes, believe it or not, the Renaissance gave us not just painters and poets, but the first celebrity chefs. You watch as courtiers pass, nodding politely at the nobles, then pausing to bow to the man who roasted the lamb in honey and lavender. You overhear one lady whisper, "He studied in Florence under the great Scapi." You know. Her friend gasps as if she just learned he trained under Da Vinci himself. It's a strange thing to witness. A cook, once considered a mere servant, now walks the halls like an artist. Because here's the truth in the Renaissance. Cooking becomes a performance, and the chef becomes the performer. Take Bartolomeo Scapi. For example, the Pope's personal chef, the one with the 6-volume cookbook we mentioned earlier. He's like the Renaissance's Gordon Ramsay, minus the swearing and the television. Scapi didn't just write recipes, he documented entire menus, designed kitchen equipment, and even described how to carve meat in front of an audience. Historians still debate whether Scapi was the first true celebrity chef, or simply the best documented. But others followed in his footsteps, chefs who became famous across cities, poached by rival courts, gifted with gold rings. And this part's important, feared. Why feared? Because chefs held power. The power to delight, the power to impress foreign ambassadors, the power to accidentally poison someone, or not so accidentally. You overhear an old joke tonight. The chef serves everyone, but he only fears the taster. And indeed, in many courts, official tasters are appointed. Young men with sturdy stomachs and a very high tolerance for risk. You see one nearby, eyeing his meat tart skeptically before taking a bite. He pauses, waits, then nods. The room exhales. One fringe detail that sticks in your mind: some chefs wore rings engraved with protective prayers or saints' names. Not because of superstition, but because they were blamed for anything that went wrong at a feast. If the bread's too tough, The cook? If the wine's too sour, the cook? If someone chokes on a fishbone and dies? Definitely the cook. So the kitchen, once a hidden, grimy space, becomes a stage, and its performers masters of timing, technique, and a touch of theatrical flair. You watch Giovanni give instructions with just a glance. His team moves like dancers. One slices oranges into paper-thin moons. Another spoons cream into pastry shells shaped like roses. A third lifts the silver cover from the main dish, a pie filled with tiny birds that flutter out when opened. Yes, that's real. Historians still argue whether these surprise pies were common or just the Renaissance version of clickbait. But it happened. You see it with your own eyes tonight. The birds flap, the guests squeal, and Maestro Giovanni gives the faintest smile of a man who knows he's just secured a job for another year. Not all chefs had it so good. In lesser courts or merchant homes, cooks remained servants. But the rise of print, fame, and culinary rivalry elevated a select few into near legends. They began traveling, collecting techniques, combining regional dishes into entirely new creations. You once met a chef from Naples who added cinnamon to his pasta sauce just to upset the Florentines. You liked him instantly. There's also an emerging culture of signature dishes. Chefs begin crafting meals not just to impress, but to say this is mine. A fish stew that only tastes right when Giovanni makes it. A roast duck that no one else can glaze quite the same way. And sometimes that fame outlives them. One cook you read about, Martino of Como, worked in the 15th century and influenced every chef who came after him. His name echoes through kitchens like a seasoning of its own. You find a copy of one of his recipes written in charcoal on a pantry wall. Faded, but still legible. And you realize chefs are leaving fingerprints. Not just on bread dough or pastry shells, but on culture, on history, on memory. Tonight, as the final course is served, almond milk custard. Shaped like a lily, you slip into the shadows of the corridor. You see Giovanni remove his cap, wipe his brow, and smile faintly to himself. He's not holding a brush, but he just painted a masterpiece. Your teeth sink into something that is not quite bread, not quite cake. It's sweet, sticky, dusted with fine white powder that glimmers in the candlelight. You don't know what to call it, but it tastes like decadence, like celebration, like someone whispered, "You deserve joy," and then baked it. This is sugar. And this is the moment dessert becomes a spectacle. Because in the Renaissance, sugar makes its long-awaited transformation from rare medicine to edible art form, and eventually, to obsession. You recline slightly as a servant walks by carrying a platter sculpted entirely out of sugar. Not just a tray of sweets, no. The tray itself is sugar, molded into the shape of a castle with sugar glass windows, spun sugar flags, and tiny sugar guards. One of them's lost a leg, which somehow makes it more charming. The guests applaud. Someone gasps. You look at your bite of custard and feel wildly underdressed. Let's rewind for a moment. In medieval Europe, sugar was a medicine, reserved for the ill or the extremely rich. It was sold by apothecaries and prescribed for everything from melancholy to stomach aches. Honey was the sweetener of the people. Sugar, the stuff of kings. But during the Renaissance, trade explodes, roots open. Colonization begins. Plantations form in the Canary Islands and eventually the Americas. And sugar becomes slightly more accessible and infinitely more fashionable. Now, it's not just an ingredient, it's a performance. Historians still debate when sugar truly crossed from the sick room to the dining hall. But once it didn't sneak. It danced in, wearing gold leaf and carrying a tray of candied violets. You see it in courses now, actual dessert courses, served after the main meal, meant to delight, surprise, and send you home dreaming in marzipan. And oh, the marzipan! Almond paste mixed with sugar, kneaded like dough and shaped into everything from miniature pigs to fruit baskets. You meet a boy who sculpts a marzipan fish so lifelike you hesitate to eat it. He winks. Eat the tail first? It's the sweetest part. Some desserts are boiled like fruit preserves, candied peels, and sugar syrup served with spiced wine. Others are baked tarts with custard centers, crumbles of nuts and spices, flaky pastries folded into triangles like edible origami. And then there's subtleties, a misleading name for one of the most over-the-top trends of the century. Subtleties are sculptural centerpieces, served during or after feasts, made entirely of edible materials, usually sugar, sometimes pastry. You've seen them shaped like mythological scenes. Ships at sea, battles, even full-sized birds. One noble's birthday featured a life-size sugar unicorn. Guests were allowed to eat the horn. And here's the twist, these sugary wonders aren't just tasty, they're political. Hosting a foreign ambassador. You might serve a sugar sculpture of his homeland's capital accurate to the rooftops. Want to honor your king, commission a dessert shaped like a crown. Want to insult your rivals. Serve a subtlety showing your army stomping on theirs. In sugar, it's basically edible propaganda. One French story you overhear, a Venetian lord once served a sugar fortress with cannons that actually fired powdered cinnamon when tapped. It caused mild chaos and a coughing fit, but it was legendary. Of course, not everyone can afford this. Sugar is still pricey. Common folk sweeten with honey or dried fruit. But as trade expands, sugar begins to trickle downward, showing up in festival pastries, market candies, and eventually breakfast. Yes, breakfast pastries start to appear. Breads enriched with dried fruit, cinnamon buns, soft sweet rolls. They're simpler than court desserts, but they speak the same language, joy. And then comes health panic. Just as quickly as sugar is embraced, some thinkers begin to worry. Is it addictive? Does it corrupt the body? The soul? One physician declares that sugar excites the blood and should be taken only in moderation like wine or flattery. You smile at this. You've just had 3 honey tarts. You'll risk it. Some even claim sugar can alter the humors, throwing your body into imbalance if overconsumed. Historians still debate whether this led to a drop in sugar use among certain elites, or if people just nodded politely and kept chewing. And here's a fascinating twist as sugar grows in popularity. So does tooth decay, especially among the rich. You see a noblewoman smile through rose-petal lips, her teeth already tinged with shadow. She hides it well, but the irony is bitter. Back in the kitchen, you watch as a cook boils sugar and water together until it becomes glassy and golden. She pours it onto a greased board and shapes it into ribbons before it hardens. Candy, she says, for the children and the gods. Tonight, the final course is laid out in silence. Almond cake, glazed figs, dates stuffed with ground pistachio and cloves. Someone toasts to Venus, goddess of pleasure. You raise your glass too. Why not? And as the sweet sticks to your lips and your eyelids grow heavy, you realize the Renaissance didn't just give us dessert. It gave us the idea that sweetness could be sacred. And some nights, that's enough. You're standing on a dock in Seville, watching a ship being unloaded. The crew smells like seawater and fermented oranges, and their cargo baskets of plants you don't recognize, smooth-skinned tubers, bright red fruits, knobby roots with names you can't pronounce. One sailor holds up a shriveled green pod and says, "This one makes people fall in love." You blink. he grins, or go to war. Depends on the cook. Welcome to the Great Food Migration, a quiet revolution where Renaissance plates are forever changed by the stuff brought home by ships. Because while painters were inventing perspective and philosophers were inventing reasons to wear togas again, explorers were sailing west, and what they brought back would explode across European kitchens. Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, cacao, vanilla, turkeys, peppers, beans, pineapples. Imagine someone who's only ever known cabbage and turnips biting into a tomato for the first time. It's juicy, red, acidic, confusing. Is it a fruit, a vegetable poison? No one knows. Historians still argue whether the tomato was welcomed with joy or suspicion. Early on, it was grown as an ornamental plant. In some regions, it was avoided entirely. Deadly nightshade's cousin, they whispered. But in others, especially Italy, it caught on. Quietly, then passionately. And then there's the potato. Humble, dirty, delicious. It arrived in Europe and took its sweet time climbing up the social ladder. At first, people fed it to animals, then the poor, then everyone. It would eventually become a staple. But here in the Renaissance, it's still that weird underground apple. Cacao, that bitter bean that will one day rule the world, was met with curiosity. The Aztecs drank it spiced and unsweetened. Europeans wrinkled their noses and added sugar until it morphed into something recognizable chocolate. You try it in a cup, warm and thick, spiced with cinnamon. It's rich, dark, intense, like drinking the idea of a thunderstorm. Vanilla follows, subtle and floral, a whisper of scent before it explodes into baked custards and sweet sauces. Meanwhile, turkeys strut into the scene with all the confidence of a bird that knows it's got charisma. Large, flavorful, and easy to raise, they replace peacocks on noble tables and quickly become the centerpiece of feasts. Someone suggests dressing them in gold leaf. You pretend not to hear. Corn arrives too, but not everyone knows what to do with it. Some grind it into flour. Others try to boil it like barley. Eventually, it finds its niche. But for now, it's the grain with an identity crisis. You see markets begin to change. Stalls that once sold onions and leeks now include capsicum peppers in bright reds and yellows. Some call them Indian spice fruit. Others just call them hot. One vendor offers you a bite. You cry politely. And don't forget beans kidney, lima, black, pinto. They quietly integrate into stews and porridges, sneaking their way into daily diets like culinary hitchhikers. This exchange isn't one way. As New World foods arrive in Europe, Old World staples like wheat, grapes, and olives are shipped abroad. Colonizers bring cattle, pigs, and chickens to places that never had them. And the world's food web stretches tight across oceans. Of course, behind the wonder and novelty lies a darker truth. These food exchanges are part of colonial systems wrapped in violence, conquest, and exploitation. The sugar plantations that fuel dessert trends are worked by enslaved hands. The cacao beans that become fashionable are harvested in stolen lands. You taste the excitement, but you also feel the weight. Still, in kitchens across Europe, fusion begins. Cooks start experimenting, combining old recipes with new ingredients. Tomato stews, chocolate sauces, cornmeal cakes. Dishes no one had tasted 50 years ago become staples within a generation. You meet a Spanish chef who bakes a turkey with prunes, almonds, and a hint of New World chili. It's like Spain and Mexico are dancing in my oven, he says. You believe him. And the flavors aren't the only thing changing. The idea of travel itself becomes edible. People begin asking, where did this come from? Who grew it? What else is out there? Meals become little journeys, tiny voyages of flavor that echo the ships now crowding the harbors. You visit a Florentine home where the table includes bread made from imported wheat, tomatoes grown in the courtyard, a pineapple centerpiece, and chocolate bonbons. The host boasts a global feast. You nod and chew slowly. Late that night, you wander into the kitchen and find a cook slicing a tomato, squinting at it like it still might explode. Tastes like the sun, she murmurs. And suddenly, you understand? The Renaissance didn't just bring art, books, or philosophy. It brought the world onto the plate. And every bite sweet, spicy. Strange is a reminder that food travels. Just like people. Just like stories. Just like you. You're sitting on a bench beside an herb garden, watching a monk mutter to himself over a sprig of rosemary. He sniffs, chews, mutters again. Too hot, he says, tossing the stem aside. Need something to balance the phlegm. You blink. Not because you don't understand, though, you mostly don't, but because this is your introduction to Renaissance food science, where taste is still judged less by flavor and more by bodily fluids. Welcome to the world of humors, balance, and wildly speculative cooking. Before chefs talked about umami or molecular gastronomy, Renaissance cooks had a different toolbox, the four humors. Borrowed from ancient Greek medicine and still going strong in this era, the theory claimed that every human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each one had its own qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and every food you ate affected their balance. That roast goose, hot and dry, cucumbers, cold and wet, bread. Somewhere in the middle, depending on the grain and how long it was baked. You try not to overthink it as you nibble on an almond cake and wonder what part of your soul it's rearranging. Historians still argue whether most Renaissance cooks actually believed in the humoral system or just nodded along to please physicians and employers. But one thing is certain: health and taste were deeply entangled. You visit a noble household where the cook has to consult with the family doctor before planning each meal. The lady of the house is choleric, too hot and dry, so her food must be cooling and moist. The master is melancholic and should avoid eggplants, which are cold and dry and might aggravate his gloom. You ask what's left to serve. Boiled lettuce, the cook replies with a sigh. But while the theory sounds rigid, it creates space for experimentation. Chefs begin to tinker with ingredients to adjust their humoral properties. Roast too spicy. Add vinegar to cool it down. Fruit too cold. Bake it. Even herbs are selected based on their temperaments. Parsley is warming. Mint is cooling. Basil is considered uplifting. And so, Renaissance cooking becomes a kind of culinary alchemy, not just matching flavors, but harmonizing bodily states. Some even believe certain dishes can prevent disease. You try a fish stew laced with fennel and lemon, rumored to ward off the plague. It doesn't, but it's delicious. You come across a book titled On the Properties of Things, where foods are listed like spell ingredients. Boiled turnip softens the belly. Raw onions provoke laughter but cloud the mind. You try not to laugh, then you eat an onion. Jury's still out. Meanwhile, something new is brewing literally. In apothecaries' back rooms, scholars are experimenting with distillation. They're boiling herbs and alcohol to make tinctures, tonics, even spirits. Some call them medicine. Others call them liquor. You taste one and call it fire. It clears your sinuses and possibly peels the lining from your throat. Over time, cooks and scholars begin blending observation with tradition. Not all agree with the ancient ways. Some question whether food really affects humors or if people just want excuses to avoid kale. The more daring thinkers start collecting empirical data, noticing which ingredients spoil fastest, which combinations cause indigestion, which methods preserve flavor best. You meet a cook in Padua who's obsessed with garlic. He keeps a journal of how long each clove roasts before becoming sweet, but not sleepy. He lets you taste one batch. It's creamy, nutty, nothing like the sharp sting you expected. The fire changes everything, he says. Fire is a flavor. One curious side effect of all this science menus start becoming seasonal. Not just because of availability, but because food is now tailored to weather, temperament, and health. Cold soup in summer, spiced wine in winter. You attend a spring feast that features wild greens and rosewater sweets. The host declares it balancing. You declare it delicious. Still, not all experiments are successes. One noble insists on a digestive tart made with pears, prunes, and ground pepper. The result is somewhere between a jam and a threat. But everyone applauds anyway. It's polite. You also hear about food testing for poison, especially in royal courts. Tasters sample dishes. Physicians stand by. And sometimes even pets are fed scraps to see if they keel over. It's dramatic. And yet, you can't deny in this era, food is serious business. And as science grows slowly, unevenly, taste begins to emerge as something beyond medicine. People start describing texture, savor, aroma. Meals are no longer just about balance. They're about pleasure. One chef calls it mouth harmony. You call it progress. Later, as you walk through a spice garden under a rising moon, you pick a sprig of thyme and crush it between your fingers. The scent is sharp, almost lemony. You don't know if it's hot or cold, wet or dry. You just know it smells like dinner. And maybe, just maybe, that's all the science you need tonight. The table is set, but no one dares eat yet. Not because they're waiting for grace, though, that's part of it, but because the centerpiece is staring at them. A roasted fish. Maybe no. A pastry? Wait, is that a deer? No. It's a pie shaped like a castle, with crenellated crusts and tiny edible soldiers standing guard. And perched proudly at the top a small roasted quail, wearing a sugar crown. You blink. You've just sat down at a Renaissance feast where the food looks more like sculpture than sustenance. Because here in this glowing candlelit hall, cooking is no longer just a craft, it's art. And Renaissance art, as you already know, doesn't do subtle... Let's start with the basics. The era of plain stews and modest loaves is over. Now, presentation matters. Food must delight the eyes before it ever reaches the tongue. If it doesn't dazzle at first glance, it might as well be chicken feed. So chefs begin to craft meals like painters prepare canvas colors, shapes, symmetry. Tarts become sunbursts. Salads are arranged like flower beds. Even meat is sliced with careful precision, layered into mosaics of duck, pigeon, and veal. You once see a dish described as a banquet within a banquet, a hollowed-out loaf filled with layers of roast meat, root vegetables, spiced fruit, and herbs, all concealed under a crust glazed with gold leaf. The guest who cuts into it reveals a hidden tableau. There are cheers. Someone claps. You wonder how much it costs to make a pie that tells the story. Historians still argue whether this elaborate plating was truly for flavor or simply for visual impact. The answer is somewhere in between, because in this age, taste and beauty begin to intertwine. Just like in painting, light and shadow matter in presentation. Caramelized glazes catch the flicker of candlelight. Dishes are arranged with symmetry in mind, mirrored platters, repeating shapes. Even the vessels become art porcelain from China. Silver chargers engraved with family crests. Venetian glassware that sparkles even before the wine arrives. You see a fruit platter shaped into a still life, like something Caravaggio might have painted. Grapes arranged just so. Figs split open to reveal their pink hearts. A pomegranate carved into a blooming flower. It's beautiful and terrifying. You don't know whether to eat it or just write a poem. And then there's the trend of illusion foods. Oh yes, the Renaissance loves a prank wrapped in pastry. You sit down to what appears to be a roast suckling pig, only to discover it's a shell filled with chopped rabbit and raisins. A bowl of apples turns out to be marzipan, dyed and glossed. A roast bird. Nope. Just cleverly molded veal and breadcrumbs. You once bite into what looks like an egg and find cheese, pepper, and ground almonds instead. You nod politely. It tastes like confusion. One cook you meet prides himself on making meat dishes look like desserts, and desserts look like meat. People eat more when they're surprised, he says. You're not sure if he's right, but his ham cake is oddly compelling. And while courtly kitchens push the boundaries of food as theater, smaller households are picking up on these ideas too. You visit a merchant's home where the host's daughter has arranged a salad to look like a swan. It's charming, slightly wilted, but clearly made with love. Another curious element: color. Color isn't just a side effect, it's the goal. Chefs dye sauces with saffron for yellow, spinach for green, beets for red. Pastry crusts are brushed with egg yolk for that perfect golden sheen. Someone suggests making blue pudding with iris petals. You decline. And let's not forget layered dishes, desserts that look like towers. Pies that reveal concentric circles when sliced. Terrines stacked like geological cross-sections. One dish you taste has 6 colors, 3 textures, and 0 chance of being replicated at home. In Florence, you attend a banquet where each course is themed after a classical element. Earth-truffled root vegetables and roasted boar, air quail wrapped in pastry feathers, waterfish floating in aspic, fire-flaming brandy over pears. It's ambitious, and possibly a bit much, but you admire the commitment, and through it all, you begin to understand something deeper. This isn't just about showing off. It's about storytelling. Renaissance artists told stories in paint. Musicians told stories in sound. And now, chefs are telling stories on plates using ingredients instead of pigments, flame instead of brushes, the palette instead of the page. One guest leans over to you and whispers, "You know it's good when you feel guilty cutting into it." You smile and slice carefully. By the end of the night, you're full but also full of wonder. Because you've tasted something that's more than just food. You've tasted a philosophy that beauty matters, even when it disappears in a single bite. And tomorrow they'll do it all again. New guests, new dishes, new stories. Because in the Renaissance, dinner isn't just nourishment. It's art that melts in your mouth. The silver goblets sparkle. The table glows beneath its lace cloth. And you, by some miracle or misfortune, have found yourself seated at the dinner table of the Medici family. You try not to fidget. You try not to sweat. You try not to blink too often, because here, in the heart of Florence, dinner is politics, and you're one spoonful of soup away from committing social treason. The Medici aren't just any family, they're the family. Bankers, rulers, patrons of the arts, and walking proof that money can absolutely buy influence and style, and approximately 6 different kinds of truffle. You look around. The dishes are laid out like treasures. A roast peacock redressed in its feathers. A platter of oysters on ice from Pisa. A pie filled with quail eggs and pine nuts. You think back to the crusty barley bread and boiled cabbage of your peasant neighbors and try not to laugh out loud. Because this is a feast with consequences. Renaissance banquets like this one serve many purposes. Yes, they feed you, but more importantly, they display wealth, forge alliances, and test loyalty. You don't just eat, you perform. A meal with the Medici is part theater, part test, part opportunity to impress someone who could change your life with a flick of the wrist. Historians still argue whether the Medici dined for pleasure or strategy. But here's what's certain. Every bite counts. You notice that even where you sit matters. Proximity to the host implies importance. If you're far down the table, you're either expendable or they're hoping you'll stay quiet. You glance at your seat just close enough to the Duchess to hear her laugh, but not close enough to make eye contact. Safe. The menu is its own declaration. The Medici favor variety and elegance. Local ingredients served in unexpected ways. Imported spices to show their reach. Even the vegetables are arranged like they were composed by Botticelli. You take a bite of something green and buttery, possibly involving artichoke and alchemy. You don't ask questions, you just chew. Each course is announced, carried in with fanfare. A server whispers the name of the dish in your ear as if delivering state secrets. Pigeon breast with pomegranate glaze. Salmon with orange blossom water. Lamb in fig syrup, in the Neapolitan fashion. It's like someone emptied a perfume bottle into a cookbook. And yet somehow it works. Nearby, a visiting noble attempts to compliment the food. He says your chef must have studied under the Venetians. A silence falls. Someone coughs. Apparently, the Medici would rather eat Venetian food than be compared to Venice. You make a note, don't mention Venice. And then, of course, there are the conversations, each one a tightrope walk over a bowl of custard. The Medici speak in coded language, sweetened by compliments and spiced with subtle insults. A comment about a pastry's crust turns into a critique of tax policy. A toast to the Pope doubles as a warning to a rival. You chew carefully and speak less. One odd tradition you observe diners exchanging token bites of food. Taste this, someone says, offering a spoonful of pear compote. It seems generous, but it's also a test of trust, of manners, of what you think is too sweet. The Medici children dine in silence. They're learning. One boy picks up his knife incorrectly and gets a gentle flick to the wrist from his governess. You smile, then hide it. At the halfway point, entertainment arrives: a lute player, a juggler, a man who tells a moral fable involving a fox and a wheel of cheese. Everyone claps. You have no idea what it meant, but you pretend to laugh in the right places. Dessert is served with philosophy. A scholar at the far end begins quoting Plato while biting into a marzipan fig. He argues that beauty in food reflects harmony in the soul. Someone else counters that true virtue lies in restraint. The Duke nods. The desserts continue arriving anyway. You catch a glance from the cook just briefly, through the swinging door. He looks exhausted, proud, terrified, and probably 10 minutes away from yelling at someone about a missing spoon. Because while the guests feast, the kitchen is a war zone of deadlines. Still, everything arrives as if conjured by magic, steaming, golden, aromatic, alive. And somewhere in the middle of all this, you have a strange realization this isn't just about excess. It's about identity. The Medici are telling a story about who they are, what they value, what kind of future they want to eat their way into. Each dish is a message. Each bite, a signature. This isn't food, it's diplomacy garnished with rosemary. By the time the meal ends, you're full in every possible way. Stomach, mind, nerves. You've said nothing foolish. You've spilled nothing. You didn't compliment the wrong city. And you remembered not to eat the garnish. Probably. As you stand to leave, someone murmurs, "You handled yourself well." You nod. You exhale. You float out of the hall like a meat-stuffed ghost. And in the corridor, far from the clatter of cutlery and delicate conspiracies, you whisper to yourself. That was more dangerous than battle, but worth every bite. You're standing at the back of a stone chapel, watching the glow of candles flicker across quiet faces. The scent of incense hangs in the air, sharp and cloying, with just a trace of onions. That's odd. Then you remember it's Friday, which means fish, which means even here, in the hush of holy space, food rules apply. Because in the Renaissance, religion doesn't just shape your soul, it controls your plate. You glance around and see monks quietly filing out from the chapel toward the refectory, their sandals slapping against the cool floor. No talking during meals. Just a bell, a prayer, and the scrape of spoons on bowls. You follow behind, careful to keep your footsteps silent. Dinner tonight, lentils, bread, and a suspiciously enthusiastic portion of pickled turnip. The main ingredient missing meat, and not because of scarcity, but because faith demands it. Welcome to the world of monks, fasting, and culinary commandments. The church plays a massive role in shaping how, when, and what people eat during the Renaissance. It's not just about dietary preference, it's about spiritual discipline. Your stomach, according to the church, is both your greatest temptation and your most direct path to holiness. And that means eating with restraint, or, in some cases, not eating at all. Fasting days are frequent and specific Fridays to commemorate the crucifixion, Advent, in preparation for Christmas, Lent, for 40 days leading to Easter. There are entire months where meat is forbidden. In some particularly zealous communities, even dairy is banished. You once met a merchant who declared, "During Lent, my table has more exceptions than a lawyer's scroll." He winked and bit into a pie labeled vegetable, which clearly included goose. Historians still argue whether fasting was strictly observed or creatively reinterpreted. The answer, yes, in monasteries, the rules are followed with grim precision. But outside those walls, loopholes abound. Take fish, for instance. The church allows it during fasting because it's not meat of the land, so people suddenly develop an intense love for aquatic life. Eel, pike, trout, carp, even beaver. Yes, beaver because it's a water-dwelling animal and, therefore, counts as fish. A bishop once defended serving beaver tail during Lent with the phrase, "It swims, doesn't it?" You sit down beside a monk and watch him tear his bread slowly, dipping it into a bowl of thin soup. He doesn't speak, but his eyes are kind. You notice he's wearing an apron beneath his robe. Later, you learn he's the monastic cook, responsible not just for feeding bodies, but for maintaining spiritual balance through food. Monastic kitchens are marvels of order and repetition. Meals are timed with prayers. Ingredients are measured with the same care given to transcribing scriptures. And the dishes, while simple, are often surprisingly tasty. You taste a barley stew with leeks and herbs that could give any noble kitchen a run for its florins. One quirky tradition monks brewing ale. Yes, even during fasting, Asyain. Because brace yourself, liquid doesn't break the fast. And so beer becomes both sustenance and loophole. Some monasteries even develop signature brews that draw pilgrims from miles away. You sample one thick enough to chew and suddenly understand how monks got through 40 days without bacon. You also hear of nuns creating cheese a gift from the Lord. They claim that doesn't count as meat and keeps remarkably well. Some varieties become famous enough to earn nicknames like Christ's Crumble and Sainted Curd. You try one that smells like damp sandals but tastes like salvation. Outside the cloistered world, the faithful try to observe as best they can. Fishmongers do brisk business. Bakers offer special fasting breads made with oil instead of butter. Street vendors rebrand pies as penitence parcels. You suspect the filling hasn't changed a bit. And there's feasting, too. The church calendar includes feasts as well as fasts, celebrations for saints, festivals, holy days. These are the times when restrictions lift and the tables groan. You attend a feast for Saint Joseph that includes roasted lamb, honeyed fruits, and a cake shaped like a carpenter's tools. Someone slices the hammer first. There's also symbolism in food. Lamb for Christ, bread for the body, wine for the blood. Almonds, with their hard shells and sweet centers, are said to represent spiritual truth. You see a plate of them passed around after a particularly long homily. Everyone chews thoughtfully. Even cooking techniques reflect belief. Boiling is pure. Roasting is festive. Fermentation, a metaphor for transformation. One monk tells you, yeast is like grace. Small, but it changes everything. And while some complain about the limits, the hunger, the fish, others find comfort in the rhythm. The cycle of fast and feast, silence and song, abstinence and abundance, it becomes a kind of spiritual heartbeat. You watch a monk in the kitchen tonight, stirring a pot of lentils as the evening bell rings. He hums a chant, tasting the broth and adjusting with a pinch of marjoram. His face is peaceful, focused, present. Because for him, cooking is prayer. And for you, in this moment, the simplicity of his meal feels like more than just food. It feels like clarity, like stillness served in a wooden bowl. And maybe that's the miracle. The market opens with a yawn and a shout. Somewhere behind you, a donkey brays. A butcher sharpens his cleaver with alarming enthusiasm. And a baker flips flatbreads with the confidence of a man who hasn't burned his fingers since the last plague. The stalls are a kaleidoscope of color cabbages, lemons, pottery, cured meat hung like garlands, and the air smells like possibility. And fish. Mostly fish. This isn't a royal kitchen or a monastery refectory. This is the Renaissance food market, and it's where the real culinary revolution takes place. Because while noble banquets get the paintings and poets, it's here, among the haggling, gossiping, bartering, and stealing, that everyday food changes forever. You weave between stalls with a small basket and even smaller hope of avoiding a pickpocket. You pass a spice merchant hawking genuine saffron that smells suspiciously like hay. A boy offers you a perfectly ripe tomato that's about 6 days away from being edible. A woman with a chicken under her arm tries to sell you a duck. You don't ask questions. Markets are nothing new. Of course, but during the Renaissance, they explode in scale and variety. Trade routes widen. City populations boom. And with them comes a flood of new ingredients, tools, and culinary expectations. Suddenly, it's not just about feeding yourself, it's about how well you can feed yourself. Flavor matters. Presentation matters. And even in the working class, meals become aspirations. Historians still debate whether these shifts were driven more by economics or vanity. Either way, What used to be a daily chore becomes a social performance. You see housewives in crisp aprons haggling dramatically over garlic prices, merchants boasting of their fresh figs from Naples, apprentices comparing which cheese lasts longer without turning on you in the night. You step into a covered area filled with foodstuffs you wouldn't have seen 50 years ago. Bright yellow cornmeal, cocoa nibs, dried beans with patterns that look like constellations. You even spot vanilla pods, shriveled and dark, sold at a price that suggests they once grew in a palace. One curious trend: food pricing becomes seasonal, not just in terms of supply and demand, but because certain foods are tied to religious calendars, festivals, or, let's be honest, fashion. The winter of 1496 was apparently the year of the parsnip, and no one can explain why. People are eating differently now, even without access to royal kitchens. Peasants roast onions in ashes and call it rustic charm. Butchers start selling smaller cuts for households who can't afford a full roast. Bakeries offer market day tarts with whatever fruit is about to go bad. The result? Creative. Thrifty cooking that's often more innovative than anything happening in gold-plated dining halls. You meet a young cook named Lucia, apprentice to a mid-level merchant family. She buys bruised apples on purpose because they bake better. She says she uses leftover bread to thicken soups, stale wine to soften game, and beet juice to make dumplings look like rubies. Presentation is half the trick. She winks. Another change: food stalls begin catering to crowds. Fast food is not a modern invention. Renaissance cities have street vendors selling everything from fried fish to honey cakes, from roasted chestnuts to meat pies so greasy you could use them to shine boots. People grab a bite on the go between trades. After church, or during long political speeches in the square, one vendor hands you a slice of hot focaccia and says, "No time to eat like a noble." But who wants to be one anyway? And for the growing middle class, the merchants, the guild members, the skilled artisans, food becomes a kind of social elevator. They can't host grand banquets, but they can offer variety, seasoning, and occasionally dessert. You attend a dinner in a modest townhouse where the host serves rice pudding with cinnamon and orange zest. It's delicious, and clearly a statement. One fascinating detail: menus begin appearing in taverns. Scrawled in chalk, limited, of course, but present. You see one that reads, bread and cheese 3 coins, sausage and wine 5 coins, surprise stew price negotiable. You go with surprise stew. It tastes like hope and regret. In the countryside, things change more slowly, but even there, urban influence trickles in. Traveling merchants bring new seeds. Traveling priests bring new fasting rules. Recipes spread like gossip. A farmer's wife you meet boasts of her new Florentine spinach tart, which is actually just greens in crust, but who's counting? Markets also become centers of news. What's in season? Who's feasting? Who's fasting? What did the Duke eat last week? And can we afford to imitate it with goat instead of lamb? Food becomes not just nourishment, but narrative. Tonight, as the market closes and the lanterns dim, you sit on a worn bench beside a barrel of olives. Your basket is full: a crusty loaf, a wedge of cheese, a handful of figs, and a sprig of rosemary tucked in like a secret. And you realize something simple and beautiful. The Renaissance didn't just revolutionize feasts. It transformed the market. It turned shopping into theater, cooking into craft, and everyday meals into tiny, edible acts of art. You bite into a fig. It tastes like history, ripened just right. You duck through a low archway and step into a warm, smoky kitchen Not the kind run by shouting men with stained aprons and cleavers, but one humming with quiet efficiency. At the center stands a woman with flour on her hands and a knife in her belt, her eyes scanning the room like a general assessing her troops. She calls out instructions in a tone that brooks no nonsense, stir slower. Chop finer. And for heaven's sake, don't scorch the sage again. This is Maria, and she's in charge. Welcome to the world of Renaissance women in the kitchen, where behind every grand feast, beneath every shimmering platter, is the labor of hands history tried very hard to forget. Because while male chefs gained fame in royal courts and cookbooks were written under noble names, the actual daily work of preparing food in most households, especially middle and working class homes, fell to women. Mothers, daughters, widows, servants, nuns. Their stories simmer just beneath the surface of culinary history. You move closer and watch Maria shape dough into delicate spirals. Her fingers move like she was born with a rolling pin. Her daughter tends a pot of onions, and her niece grinds almonds for a sauce. The scent is hypnotic sweet, earthy, like a memory your stomach remembers even if your brain doesn't. And this isn't just dinner, it's skill, passed down over generations not from books, but by doing. Historians still debate how much influence women truly had over Renaissance cuisine, given that men wrote the cookbooks and ran the fancy kitchens. But open any door in any street in Florence, Genoa, or Lyon, and you'll find women like Maria running the show. Not for fame, for survival, for family, for excellence. One widow you meet tells you she supports herself by baking rosewater cakes for weddings. She has no formal training, no printed recipe, but her pastries are legendary. She rolls out her dough on a marble slab passed down from her grandmother, muttering. Good pastry needs cold stone and warm hands. In noble homes, women of status weren't always cooking, but they managed the kitchen, oversaw inventories, and planned meals. The mistress of the house had to ensure the household ran like a clock, especially the larder. Salt, spices, oil, flour, every speck counted. Some even kept detailed ledgers of consumption. One lady, famed for her penny pinching, once fired a servant for inappropriate use of saffron. You're still not sure what that means. Then there were the servants, usually women, who did the chopping, baking, washing, and scouring. They worked long hours in hot kitchens with blistered fingers and aching feet, often starting as young as 10. One girl you meet says she dreams of becoming a cook in a merchant's home someday. They eat oranges there, she says, eyes wide. But women weren't limited to the home. Some began operating food businesses, running taverns, selling pies, brewing ale, or managing market stalls. These weren't just side hustles, they were livelihoods. In some towns, widows had legal rights to inherit and operate food shops. You hear of one woman in Bologna who ran a wine bar for 30 years. She served stewed beans and philosophy with equal flair. And in convents, women developed entirely new food traditions. Nuns kept herb gardens, brewed medicinal tonics, and developed desserts so delicious they eventually became local legends. The nuns' kisses, almond cookies you eat in Siena Yep, those came from behind cloistered walls. There's also the dark thread that winds through some kitchen's poison. Yes, it's grim, but it's real. Women with access to food preparation could, in rare but notorious cases, wield deadly power. You hear whispers of a cookmaid in Naples who helped a mistress remove a troublesome husband with a well-seasoned stew. One chronicler even claimed that knowledge of poisons passed quietly through the hands of women, like a dangerous spice. But for every dark tale, There are dozens of quiet ones of women feeding entire households, healing with broth, celebrating with cake. No fanfare, just nourishment. And their inventiveness, it's unmatched. You taste a lentil dish flavored with vinegar, orange peel, and bay leaf. Simple, complex, genius. You ask Maria if she found it in a book. She laughs. No, I dreamed it. Then I fixed it. One fringe detail you love. Some women began keeping personal recipe journals not for publishing, but for their daughters. Written in margins on scraps, passed down with notes like, "Only serve this when the baby is sleeping," or "Add more sugar if your husband is in a mood." You leaf through one such journal and see a faded entry to make pear tarts that comfort the heart, bake slowly. Whisper while you wait. You don't know who wrote it, but you feel like you do. Tonight, the kitchen finally cools. Maria wipes her brow with the back of her hand, looks around, and smiles. The stew is ready. The bread is risen. The table is set. And you realize that this quiet space hidden from courts, scholars, and history books is where Renaissance food truly lived. Not in gilded halls, but here, in the hands of women. You're riding in the back of a cart rattling over cobblestones, passing through fields of ripening grain and into a village where smoke curls from chimneys and someone's baking something that smells aggressively like butter. You hop down and follow the scent through twisting alleys until you find a tavern where sausages hang from the rafters like wind chimes and a woman stirs something thick and bubbling in a copper pot. She waves you in. You've just arrived in Germany, or maybe France, or Spain. It doesn't matter exactly. What matters is that every region of Renaissance Europe had its own culinary heartbeat. And tonight, you're about to eat your way through a dozen dialects and flavor maps without ever leaving the continent. Because while the Renaissance gave us forks and cookbooks and marzipan castles, it also gave rise to a quietly delicious truth, where you lived deeply influenced what and how you ate. Let's start in France. In the 1500s, French cuisine begins taking on its elegant, saucy form. Butter becomes a staple. Wine is not just a beverage, but a base for broths, stews, and reductions. Herbs are used with near religious devotion. Parsley, thyme, tarragon, chervil. You watch a French cook stir a chicken fricassee and whisper something in Latin as he adds cream. You're not sure if it's a prayer or a threat. Either way, it tastes heavenly. Historians still argue whether France or Italy took the culinary lead during this time. The truth, they were probably just copying each other with flair, and sometimes rivalry improves the recipe. Then there's Italy, of course, where food is as much a conversation as it is a meal. Polenta thickens over open fires. Pasta takes a dozen new shapes, and tomatoes are just starting to make curious appearances. You dine with a merchant in Bologna who serves tortellini in broth so rich, you briefly see your ancestors. He claims the shape of the tortellini is modeled after Venus's belly button. You don't ask how he knows that. In Spain, the influence of the Moors lingers sweetly. You taste dishes filled with saffron, almonds, citrus, and cinnamon. Meat is often roasted. Fish is fried in olive oil, and dessert feels like poetry dipped in syrup. A cook hands you a plate of honey-soaked fritters and says, "This is what angels eat when they're tired." In Germany, things are heartier. Spiced meats, dense breads, ale you can chew. You attend a festival where cabbage is stuffed with veal, topped with nutmeg, and buried in a sauce that makes your tongue tingle. The baker gives you rye rolls still warm from the oven, and you carry them in your coat like precious stones. Even England, often mocked for its simple fare, is evolving. Roasts become grander. Pies become more elaborate. Sauces are thickened with almonds and egg yolk, sometimes sweetened with fruit and vinegar. You try a quince tart that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about tarts. One quirky regional detail: cheese preferences. In France, it's soft and floral. In Italy, sharp and hard. In the Netherlands, golden and mellow. Each wheel is a geographic signature. One Dutch merchant brags that his Gouda aged longer than his last marriage. And let's not forget bread, the Renaissance's quiet staple. In France, it's crusty and white. In Germany, it's dark and seeded. In Spain, flat and grilled. In Italy, dimpled with olive oil and rosemary. Each region swears theirs is superior. Each one is right. As you travel from region to region, you notice how local ingredients shape identity. Coastal towns lean on fish. Mountain villages use cured meats and root vegetables. Wine regions use grapes in both glasses and glazes. Olive-growing zones soak everything in green gold oil. Wheat-rich plains churn out noodles and dumplings like gifts from the grain gods. And then there's hospitality. In Florence, you're fed by a baker who doesn't know your name. In Prague, a butcher gives you sausage and says, "Eat first, explain later." In Lisbon, a widow insists you try her chickpea stew before the soup cools and shames the ancestors. Everywhere you go, food is a language spoken with plates and eyes and second helpings. At night, you sit by a fire with a trader who's tasted everything from Turkish sherbet to Scottish oatcakes. He tells you, the tongue remembers where it's been. Every flavor is a footprint. And you believe him. Because by now, you've tasted dozens of histories all on the same wooden spoon. And while scholars debate maps and borders, and nobles argue about sauces and seating charts, the real Renaissance hums along in kitchens and taverns and market stalls. It simmers in iron pots and crackles in open hearths. It's regional pride you can chew. Tonight, you fall asleep in a straw bed in a village you can't pronounce, belly full of something buttery, peppery, and perfect. You dream of tortellini, mustard seeds, and dark bread. And somewhere in your sleep, you smile. Because food never needed translation. It just needed salt, fire, and a place to sit down. You sit down at a table that gleams like polished moonlight. Yes, moonlight, because this isn't just a table, it's a statement. The linen is starched, the edge is embroidered, and at each place setting, nestled like a relic of divine ceremony, is a small, gleaming spoon. Beside it, a fork slim, two-pronged, almost shy. And at the top, a knife so delicately engraved, you hesitate to use it for something as vulgar as butter. You've entered the world of Renaissance tableware, and you're about to discover how cutlery became class. Because in this era, food isn't just changing how you eat, it is evolving just as dramatically. Once upon a time not that long ago, actually people ate with fingers and knives. Spoons were shared. Plates were rare. Bowls were communal. If you were polite, you wiped your hands on your tunic. If you were fancy, you used a piece of bread. But the Renaissance doesn't do shared bowls. It does personal goblets, decorated trenchers, and cups so delicate they shatter if you breathe on them wrong. Let's start with the plate. In most households, especially the humble ones, trenchers were still in use, thick slices of day-old bread used as edible plates. After a meal, the trencher might be eaten if you were hungry enough, tossed to the dogs, or given to the poor. But among the rich, trenchers go out of fashion fast. Instead, you start seeing ceramic plates, wooden platters, and eventually metal chargers, each one a little shinier and a lot more breakable than the last. By the 1500s, Italian majolica glazed brightly painted ceramic makes its way into upper-class homes. Historians still argue whether this was more about showing off or actually enhancing the meal. You suspect it was 70% vanity, 30% not wanting stew to soak into your lap, and then there's the fork, that quiet little revolution still unfolding. You've seen forks before, but now they're multiplying. Initially, they're reserved for the rich. Not because they're rare, well, they are, but because they're considered fussy, too dainty for a man. Some say unnatural to pierce your food like that. Others whisper. One bishop even wrote that using a fork was an insult to God, since hands were divinely given. Still, they catch on, especially in Italy and France. They're practical, they're elegant, and let's be honest, less sticky. Spoons, meanwhile, get their own upgrade. You begin seeing sets made from pewter, silver, even ivory. Some have rounded bowls, others pointed. One you hold is engraved with a family crest and dates from a wedding 3 decades ago. The bride's initials are still faintly visible, softened by time and soup. And knives. These are status symbols. No question. You learn that in wealthier households, guests bring their own knives, often sheathed and worn like jewelry. A well-made blade shows taste, breeding, even martial skill. A dull one, that's a tragedy. You watch a noble cut a peach so neatly it doesn't even bruise. The edge, he says, is sharper than a rumor. You pretend to understand. One curious regional difference: England lags a bit. In many homes, guests still eat with their personal knives, and forks are viewed with suspicion well into the next century. You once dined with an English merchant who lifted his roast pheasant with 2 fingers and said proudly, "None of that foreign poking." But even he uses a napkin, a Renaissance innovation you've come to appreciate. Early napkins were large. Communal cloths hung over shoulders or tucked under chins. Later, individual napkins emerge folded, scented, even shaped into animals for special occasions. You once received a napkin swan that unfolded into a full tablecloth. Magic? The drinking vessels, too, are a performance. Goblets of glass from Murano, pewter mugs engraved with verses, delicate flask with handles too small to actually grasp. Wine, water, and ale are now served in dedicated cups, often matching the occasion. You once witnessed a toast given in a glass shaped like a fish. It leaked. And what holds all this together? The table itself. Tables are longer now, wider, meant for display as much as for function. Tablecloths are bleached white and inspected for stains. You hear of a hostess who once canceled a dinner because her linens came back slightly off-white. "I serve with purity," she said. Everyone nodded, quietly judged her. In merchant homes, you see a blend: simple clay plates, wooden spoons, tin knives. But even there, the influence of the elite trickles down. A few spoons are ornamented. The napkins, though rough, are folded. Children are taught to use 2 hands to lift their bowls. There's even early etiquette books starting to circulate, printed guides on how to behave at the table. Don't pick your teeth. Don't slurp your broth. Don't sing unless asked. One book warns he who blows his nose into the tablecloth shall not be invited twice. Sound advice. Tonight, you sit at a table set for 12. Each place perfectly mirrored. Knife on the right, spoon above the bowl, fork on the left, bread plate in the upper corner. The host nods with satisfaction. And in this moment, you realize the Renaissance didn't just change what people ate. It changed how they interacted with food, with dignity, with ceremony, with aesthetic purpose. Even a simple meal becomes a kind of choreography. a dance of gestures and glances and gleaming tools. You lift your spoon, you take a bite, and you feel strangely elegant. The first sip is strange, bitter, dark, almost smoky. You try not to make a face, but your eyebrows give you away. The man across the table smiles knowingly and adds a generous spoonful of honey to his own cup. It's an acquired taste, he says. But once it grabs you, it doesn't let go. You've just been introduced to coffee. Or maybe chocolate. Or perhaps it's tea. No one seems entirely sure which one arrived first in this particular port town. What you do know is that something is shifting in the morning air of Renaissance Europe. Because suddenly, the day doesn't begin with beer or broth or crust of old bread. It begins with a drink that makes you feel awake. And that's new. Welcome to the arrival of coffee, chocolate, and caffeine culture. 3 words that don't appear on the same page until the Renaissance starts turning over trade routes and habits like well-kneaded dough. You're sitting in a small, smoky cafe or what might become a cafe. Someday watching merchants and monks alike lean over steaming cups. There's conversation, philosophy, and a lingering scent of cinnamon. The drinks are thick. The mood is sharp. Let's start with coffee. It first arrives in Europe from the Islamic world, likely via the bustling ports of Venice. Brought from Ottoman lands, where it's already deeply embedded in social rituals. Coffee enters Italy with a whiff of exoticism and a sprinkle of suspicion. Some church officials call it the devil's drink. Others try it and immediately ask for a refill. Historians still argue whether Pope Clement VIII truly baptized coffee to make it safe for Christians. But the legend persists. What's not debated is that coffee quickly spreads like wildfire through merchant towns and intellectual circles. Writers, artists, and students drink it to stay awake and sound smarter. You sip a little more and feel your thoughts race slightly ahead of your words. And then there's chocolate. Brought from Mesoamerica in the form of cacao, it's introduced not as candy, but as a beverage usually bitter. Spiced and occasionally mixed with chili, the Aztecs drank it ceremonially. Europeans try it and promptly add sugar, and then more sugar, and then cinnamon, vanilla, and milk. You taste a cup in Madrid so thick it could be sliced with a knife. A woman dips bread in it and sighs audibly. You understand completely. The spread of chocolate triggers a quiet addiction in the upper classes. It's not cheap. It's not common. But it's fashionable. You overhear a noble bragging that his wife takes her chocolate in bed, with cloves and orange peel. You try not to imagine it. And let's not forget tea arriving more slowly, mostly via Portuguese traders. At first, it's a curiosity, a delicacy, a remedy, even. Apothecaries sell it as a digestive, but before long, it seeps into social life served in salons, offered in fine porcelain cups, sipped between polite gossip and debates about Aristotle. One fringe detail. All 3 of these drinks are initially tied to moral panics. Caffeine makes people alert, which some find suspicious. Too much thought, one bishop writes, invites temptation. Meanwhile, monks debate whether drinking chocolate during Lent violates the fast. Spoiler opinions vary wildly. Still, these beverages don't go away. They multiply. They evolve. They reshape daily rhythms. In monastic communities, you notice friars trading beer for coffee during morning prayers. It keeps the mind sharp, one says, tapping his temple. In merchant houses, chocolate becomes a courtship tool served sweetly, seductively, sometimes with aphrodisiac herbs. One young woman flirts entirely in chocolate metaphors. You're both charmed and concerned. And among scholars, coffee is practically a fuel source. You attend a symposium where the only food served is bread and gallons of strong, black brew. The participants argue for 7 hours. No one blinks. This slow caffeine revolution also inspires new rituals. Tiny porcelain cups begin to appear. Ornate sugar spoons, bronze kettles, lacquered trays. In the wealthier circles, you see entire chocolate services matching pots, cups, whisks, and napkins. One man boasts his set was painted by a student of Titian. You nod, impressed, mostly because your fingers are still tingling from the cocoa. You also hear whispers of early coffee houses, public places where people gather to drink, talk, and share ideas. In some cities, they're already being watched by authorities. Too much thinking in one room. A magistrate complains. It leads to change. Which, of course, is the point. Because these drinks aren't just altering taste, they're altering time. Caffeine makes it possible to work longer, wake earlier, debate deeper. Suddenly, mornings matter. So do late nights. Meals adjust. Habits shift. You meet a baker who starts work at midnight now because the city wakes up earlier. You meet a nun who prays an extra hour each morning, fueled by the dark miracle, as she calls it. Tonight, you sit by a hearth with a mug of spiced chocolate, staring into the fire. You feel wide awake, but peaceful. Your mind hums with thoughts, connections, questions. You write a list of things to try tomorrow. Saffron pudding, lemon cakes, asking better questions. The Renaissance gave us paintings and books and buildings, but it also gave us mornings with purpose, afternoons with clarity, conversation that lasts long after the candles burn out. You take another sip and realize some revolutions start not with a bang, but with a bitter cup. You reach for the salt, and suddenly, a hand slaps yours not hard, but firmly enough to remind you that you're not at home. You freeze. Wait until the host uses it first. Someone whispers, "Otherwise, it's a statement." A statement. You blink. It's just salt. But here, at this candlelit table surrounded by velvet doublets, ruffled sleeves, and eyes that watch everything, you quickly learn dining in the Renaissance isn't just a meal, it's a minefield of unspoken rules. Welcome to the bizarre, beautiful, and occasionally absurd world of Renaissance dining etiquette, where elbows, napkins, and the angle of your soup spoon all say something about who you are, who you think you are, and whether or not you're going to get invited back. Let's start with elbows on the table. Don't do it. Seriously, it's not just impolite. It's considered lazy, vulgar, and possibly even immoral, depending on who you ask. One early etiquette book calls it a gesture of the slothful and the sinful. Another claims it indicates readiness to steal food. You check your posture. You sit straighter. Historians still debate whether these rigid dining codes were adopted from monastic discipline or military drills. But one thing's certain by the 16th century, how you ate mattered almost as much as what you ate. You observe your host. He dabs his lips with his napkin before drinking. Never after. He waits for the eldest guest to begin eating before lifting his spoon. His fingers touch only the base of his wine goblet, never the rim. It's not snobbery. It's choreography. Even the placement of utensils is becoming codified. Knife to the right, spoon above the plate, fork if one is present to the left. Not because it's faster, but because it's civilized. One nobleman you meet has a traveling case of cutlery lined in velvet. His knife has an ivory handle. His spoon is silver, and his fork has the initials of his father engraved on the back. He refers to them as his companions. And then there's how to signal when you're done. Don't just stop eating. That's barbaric. You must lay your knife and spoon across the plate, diagonally, or else the servants won't know whether to clear it or refill it. You once forget this and end up with 3 additional servings of turnip puree. No one warns you. Napkins, too, are a subject of debate. Do you tuck it into your collar or lay it across your lap? Depends where you are. In Italy, the lap is favored. In France, some still go for the collar, but only if it's done gracefully. A napkin on the table? Unacceptable. A napkin on the floor? Social death. You see a guest drop his and retrieve it so quickly you'd think he was snatching a falling diamond. One fringe practice finger bowls. At the end of the meal, small bowls of scented water, often with rose petals or citrus peels, are brought out for guests to rinse their fingertips. You mistakenly take a sip from one. A servant coughs. You nod like you meant to do it. Later, someone calls it bold. Etiquette also extends to conversation. You don't speak while chewing. You don't interrupt. You never talk about illness, war, or childbirth during dinner. And under no circumstances do you discuss the food unless invited. Compliments are welcome. Critiques dangerous. One guest makes the mistake of praising the stew a little too much. The host interprets it as sarcasm. The room goes quiet. You pretend to be fascinated by your spoon. And then there are the unspoken signals. Leaving some food on your plate could be seen as polite restraint or as an insult. If the dish was prepared by the host, eating everything could mean you're greedy or deeply appreciative. The key is to read the room and always mirror the host. You feel like you're playing a game of edible charades. Even the act of toasting has rules. You must make eye contact when you clink cups. You must not overfill your goblet. You must not toast before the host. And you must never, ever toast with water. To toast in water is to drown your blessings. One scholar says solemnly, "You raise your wine and try not to look nervous." What you wear to the table also matters. You once show up in an apron you came straight from the kitchen. Someone assumes you're a servant and hands you a plate to clear. Lesson learned. In more casual settings, of course, the rules are looser. In taverns and peasant homes, people eat with fingers, talk with mouths half full, and occasionally chase chickens from under the table. But even there, a kind of folk etiquette emerges. Don't take the last piece without offering it. Don't drink from someone else's cup. And don't tell someone their stew tastes better than usual. It's not a compliment. And yet, for all its rigidity, Renaissance dining etiquette serves a purpose. It creates structure. It turns chaos into order. It signals trust, respect, refinement, and yes, sometimes class. But at its best, it also creates a shared language, a way for strangers to sit together and feel like they're following the same rhythm, even if the dish is new and the wine is strong. Tonight, as you rise from the table, you remember to fold your napkin, set down your spoon, and nod to the host not too deeply, but enough to show gratitude. You leave full and successful. You didn't offend anyone. At least you think. The bread is still warm in your hands, and yet no one is reaching for it. Not because it's unappetizing, it smells like heaven with a hint of rosemary, but because the man at the head of the table is busy delivering a monologue about virtue, taste, and how a properly risen loaf symbolizes the balance of the cosmos. You're now at a dinner party where food has become philosophy, and no one's getting dessert until they've chewed their way through a discourse on moderation. Welcome to the part of the Renaissance where eating becomes thinking, and mealtime turns into a lecture you didn't ask for but will somehow leave feeling smarter from anyway. Let's be clear, food was always tied to ideas. But during the Renaissance, as humanism takes root and the classics are dusted off, thinkers begin to treat food not just as fuel, not even just as art, but as a lens for understanding life itself. Historians still debate who first made this leap, whether it was a monk with too much time between meals or a poet with too many figs, but by the 1500s, it's everywhere. Essays, dialogues, and letters begin to philosophize food. You meet a scholar in Padua who claims the perfect meal contains all four elements: earth bread, air-whipped egg, water fish, and fire roast meat. You nod along, wondering if wine counts as spirit. He says it does. Plato and Aristotle get quoted in kitchens now. One nobleman insists his cook follow the golden mean in every dish: not too salty, not too sweet. Balance is everything, he says. As his quail leg wobbles dramatically on a pool of honey mustard, another writer you meet is drafting a treatise on gustatory ethics, how gluttony corrupts the soul, and how restraint cultivates nobility. He still eats 2 slices of almond tart after dinner. I resist the third, he says, and thus, I am virtuous. You don't argue. And then there's the moralization of ingredients. Some foods are seen as elevating, others as base. Lentils are humble and pure. Truffles dangerous. Chocolate is indulgent and seductive. One monk calls it liquid vanity. Another calls it a cup of divine mystery. You try it again and taste both. One fascinating fringe detail: chewing speed becomes symbolic. The slower you chew, the more rational your appetite. A philosopher you dine with claims that chewing too fast indicates a mind ruled by animal instincts. You watch him nibble his cheese like he's solving a riddle. You meet a woman in Florence who writes poems about vegetables. Her ode to asparagus is surprisingly moving. It rises toward the sun, softens in heat, and bends but does not break. You never look at asparagus the same way again. In Milan, you're served a dish described as a culinary dialogue between hot and cold, raw and cooked. It's just salad with grilled peaches. But the host explains it with such passion you feel like you're witnessing a debate between Socrates and a melon. Even table manners take on new depth. Sharing food is framed as a symbol of human fellowship. One philosopher compares the act of breaking bread to the communion of minds. To pass the salt, he writes, is to pass trust. You begin handing the salt more mindfully. And don't get them started on hunger. Some thinkers argue that hunger sharpens the intellect. Others say it dulls it. One writes, to dine while hungry is to marry thought and pleasure. To dine while full is to forget both. You wonder if that's why the first course is always late. Food also becomes a metaphor for selfhood. To know what a man eats, a scholar says, is to know what he admires. You glance at your plate: lentils, crusty bread, a bit of roast pear, and wonder if that makes you wise, poor, or just slightly seasonal. You once dined with a young poet who composes lines between bites. He says, a meal should rhyme starter, main dessert, a surprise in the middle, a soft ending. His tart burns, but his company is excellent. This fusion of eating and thinking extends to education. Boys are taught not just to read Latin and wield a sword, but how to eat like a gentleman, which foods to praise, which to avoid, and how to reflect on the moral composition of a menu. Even the cookbooks change. Some begin including essays between recipes on the virtue of onions, the temperaments of sauces, why figs must be soaked before boiling, an allegory of the soul. You skip a few, you highlight others, and then, of course, the debates. Should one eat alone for reflection, or always in company for conversation? Should food be beautiful, or merely nourishing? Is indulgence ever justified? One spirited evening, you listen to a debate over whether stuffed goose represents spiritual decay or economic triumph. The cook rolls her eyes in the kitchen. "It's just goose," she mutters. You bring her a slice of quince tart and say thanks. But in your quieter moments, you start to understand the appeal. Because eating is intimate. It's physical, emotional, ritualistic. And in a time when everything from science to sculpture is being re-examined, why not the contents of your bowl? Tonight, you sit by a window with a simple plate of boiled greens, cheese, and bread. No frills, no sauces. But each bite feels deliberate, thoughtful, grounded. The moonlight reflects off your spoon. Somewhere far off, someone is quoting Plato. You just chew slowly. And smile. Because in the Renaissance, a meal is never just a meal. It's an idea you can taste. You wake to birdsong and the faint aroma of baking something sweet. Maybe honey. Maybe cinnamon. Definitely involving butter. The window shutters creak open on a world that looks strangely familiar. A woman walks by carrying a basket of pears. A boy calls out to a friend, waving a crust of bread in one hand. A cat sunbathes near the baker's stall, entirely indifferent to the Renaissance happening around it. You stretch, rub your eyes, and realize, this doesn't feel ancient anymore. It feels normal. Because even after all the peacock pies, sugar castles, meat-stuffed marzipan, and philosophy-laced fish courses, the true legacy of Renaissance food isn't just what people were eating. It's how they changed the way we eat forever. You look around the marketplace and recognize echoes of your own life. There's the fruit seller arranging pears by ripeness, not color, just like your favorite vendor at home. There's the cook, wiping down her workspace with care, preparing for the lunch rush like it's a stage show. There's even a man with a cup of dark, bitter coffee, staring into the distance like he's trying to remember how mornings worked before caffeine. It all feels familiar. Because the Renaissance gave us more than tableware and courses and cookbook pages that smelled faintly of clove and smoke. It gave us ritual. Before this era, meals were mostly survival. Get it hot, get it down, get back to work. But the Renaissance said, wait, what if food was art? What if it was communication? What if it was philosophy, medicine, identity? And so we started designing meals not just to satisfy hunger, but to say something. You think about the fork, how ridiculous it seemed, how resistant people were to using it. Now it's in every drawer. You think about sugar, once exotic, now sprinkled on everything from cereal to cereal-themed desserts. You think about tomatoes, once feared, now the star of every pizza, pasta, and questionable ketchup sculpture. Even the idea of a recipe, something you can write down, pass on, tweak, or reinterpret, is a Renaissance gift. Before, cooks had memories. Now they have legacies. Historians still argue about the exact moment this shift happened. When survival became cuisine. When eating became expression. But you don't need a date. You just need to look at your plate. Tonight, maybe you'll have roasted vegetables, a loaf of crusty bread, something simmered, something sweet. You'll light a candle, or not. You'll raise a glass, or maybe just sip tea in silence. And somewhere in that small ritual, you'll carry the echoes of a world that first asked, what does it mean to eat beautifully? And you'll answer it with a fork, and a napkin, and the soft crunch of toast. Wind down 300 words. So now, with your stomach full of stories and your thoughts gently simmering, it's time to let it all settle. Close your eyes. Let the clatter of Renaissance kitchens fade into a soft hush. Let the flickering candlelight retreat behind your lids. And the fragrance of roasted almonds, sweet herbs, and orange blossom steam drift upward like the last curl of smoke from an evening hearth. You've walked the cobbled markets, heard the hum of ladles in copper pots, and sat at tables dressed in linen and silent rules. You've tasted saffron-dyed soup, sugar spun into towers, and coffee that sparked more than conversation. But now, there are no more courses, no more lectures, just a stillness rising between you and the past. Let your breath slow. Let the tension melt from your shoulders like butter on warm bread. You've been a guest in many kitchens tonight, some grand, some humble, all filled with hands that worked, minds that wondered, and hearts that remembered. Food was their language, and you've listened well. The Renaissance taught us that flavor isn't just taste, it's memory, identity, intention, that a meal can be a painting, that bread can be philosophy, that even a sip of chocolate can remind us we're alive. So as you drift now, let those thoughts fall away. Let them dissolve. Let only the warmth remain. Sleep deeply. Dream gently. You are full. You are safe. You are home.